Harold Pruitt stood in the lobby of the Cumberland Highland Energy Partners office in Columbia, Tennessee, with his Sunday hat in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. The receptionist had asked him to wait 23 minutes already. He didn't complain. He never complained. He just stood there in his old gray suit, the one he'd worn to his wife's funeral 6 years earlier, and he waited. When Bradley Cantrell finally walked out of the back office, he didn't shake Harold's hand. He looked Harold up and down, the worn boots, the cracked leather belt, the suspenders showing through the open suit jacket, and he laughed. $8,000, Mr. Pruitt, cash, that's our final offer. You sign today or we let the county sort it out next month. You're not the first old-timer to think that pasture is worth more than it is. 3 women in the lobby looked away. A young man at the copier pretended not to hear. Harold said nothing. He adjusted his suspenders. Then he nodded once, put his hat back on, and walked out the door. 3 days later, Bradley Cantrell sat in a wood-paneled courtroom in Maury County, unable to lift his eyes from the table. Because Harold Pruitt had known something for over half a century. And his father had made sure of it long before Bradley Cantrell was ever born. Harold Wendell Pruitt was 74 years old. He lived alone on 200 acres of rolling Tennessee land just outside the small town of Mount Pleasant in Maury County, about 40 miles south of Nashville. He had inherited that land from his father, Elias Pruitt, in the autumn of 1968, when Harold was just 16 years old, and a war he never spoke of took his older brother in the same year. The farm was old, older than Harold, older than the county courthouse. The deed traced back to 1903, and the white clapboard house at the top of the hill had been built by his grandfather with locust beams cut from the back ridge. Harold drove a 1987 Chevrolet Silverado. The paint had faded from red to something close to rust. The radio only played AM. He had replaced the engine twice and the transmission once, and he saw no reason to ever replace the truck. He paid his bills in cash. He paid them early. The man who ran the feed store in Mount Pleasant said in 41 years, Harold Pruitt had never once been late on an account and never once asked for a discount. He was quiet, not unfriendly, quiet. He nodded at people in the post office. He held the door at the diner. He sat in the second-to-last pew at Mount Olive Baptist on Sunday mornings, and when the offering plate passed, he always slid in the same folded 20. His wife Alina had died in 2020. Pneumonia after a long winter. They had been married 46 years. They had no children. Harold buried her under the oak tree on the south slope of the property, the tree his father had planted in 1947 when Elias came home from the Pacific. Every Sunday after church, Harold walked up that hill, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 3. He had 2 routines that he never broke. The first was simple. On the second Friday of every month, he drove to the county courthouse and paid a $47 filing fee at the records office to maintain a small annual notation on a deed his father had recorded in 1956. The clerks had changed 3 times in 50 years. Not one of them had ever asked him what the notation was for. Harold had never offered to explain. The second was a metal box. It sat on the top shelf of his bedroom closet, behind a folded wool blanket, where his father had told him to put it on a cold morning in October of 1968, 2 weeks before Elias Pruitt died of a stroke at the age of 59. Don't open it unless somebody comes for the land, son, and if they do, you open it slow. You read every page, and then you find a lawyer who still believes in paper. Harold had not opened the box in 58 years. He hadn't needed to, until Bradley Cantrell came calling. Cumberland Highland Energy Partners was a 4-year-old natural gas operation headquartered in a glass building in Nashville's Gulch District. They drilled, they leased, they consolidated, and in the spring of 2026, they decided to consolidate Maury County. Bradley Lawson Cantrell was 34 years old. He had a Vanderbilt MBA, a custom Navy suit from a tailor on 12th Avenue South, and a haircut that cost more than Harold Pruitt's monthly grocery bill. He drove a leased Audi Q7 and listened to business podcasts on the way to work. He was, by any reasonable measure, very good at his job. His job was to acquire surface rights from elderly landowners as cheaply as possible. The internal memo that had crossed his desk on March 9th was simple. A 200-acre tract, owned by a single elderly heir, no children, no mortgage, no recent activity in the county records aside from one minor annual notation that the legal team had marked as non-substantive, likely a clerical artifact. Bradley had circled the appraisal in red pen. The land was officially valued at $440,000. He had been instructed to offer $8,000. It was, in his own words to a colleague that morning, the easiest assignment of the quarter. The first letter went out on a Tuesday. Harold did not respond. The second letter went out the following Tuesday. Harold did not respond. On the third Tuesday, Bradley drove down to Mount Pleasant himself. He found Harold in the back row of the feed store, buying mineral salt for cattle he no longer owned. He introduced himself with a handshake Harold did not return and a business card Harold did not look at. "Mr. Pruitt, I think we both know that land isn't doing anything for you anymore." Harold said nothing. "My company is prepared to make you a generous offer, cash, no closing costs, 30 days. Harold paid for his salt. He counted the change. He nodded at the cashier. Then he looked at Bradley Cantrell for the first time, and he said only 6 words. "You'll need to put it in writing." Bradley smiled. He thought he had won. He drove back to Nashville and drafted an offer that afternoon, $8,000 with a 30-day acceptance window. He added a clause stating that if Mr. Pruitt failed to respond, Cumberland Highland reserved the right to pursue any and all legal remedies regarding the disputed mineral interests beneath the parcel. He included that clause as a scare tactic. He did not believe Harold would understand it. He had no idea he had just written the sentence that would end his career. Harold drove home from the feed store the long way that afternoon. He took the gravel road past the old Henson place, then up over the ridge where the dogwoods were just beginning to bud. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't speak. He just drove, and his hands stayed at 10 and 2 on the wheel the way his father had taught him in 1964. When he got home, he made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. He looked out the window at the south slope where the oak tree stood over a leaner's headstone, and he thought for a long time. Then he went to the closet. He took down the metal box. He set it on the kitchen table next to his coffee, and he sat there with his hands folded on top of it for almost 20 minutes before he opened the lid. Inside were 4 things. A leather-bound notebook in his father's handwriting. A folded geological survey from 1957, stamped and sealed. A recorded copy of a mineral severance deed filed at the Maury County Courthouse on June 14, 1956. And a stack of $47 receipts, one for every year since 1968, totaling 58 years of unbroken filings. Harold did not open any of them yet. He picked up the rotary phone on the kitchen wall, the same phone Aliner had bought in 1979, and he dialed a number he had not called in 11 years. Marvin Ellis Tate, attorney at law, Mount Pleasant, Tennessee, picked up on the 3rd ring. "Marv, it's Harold Pruitt." There was a long pause on the other end. "Harold, Lord, it's been a while. Everything all right? Somebody come for the land?" Another pause, longer this time. "Who, what?" "Outfit out of Nashville, energy people, offered me $8,000. Marvin Tate exhaled slowly into the receiver. "Harold, you still got that box?" "I'm sitting in front of it." "Don't open another page till I get there. I'll be at your kitchen table in 40 minutes. Harold hung up. He poured a second cup of coffee. He set out a clean mug for Marvin. He looked again at the south slope, and he thought about his father standing in this same kitchen on a cold October morning in 1968, his face already drawn from the stroke that would kill him 2 weeks later. Elias Pruitt had been a quiet man too, a Marine, a farmer, a man who paid debts and kept paper. He had told Harold something that morning that Harold had carried with him for 58 years. "Son, the men who come for land in suits don't read the same papers as the men who own it. They read what's easy, they don't read what's old." Harold had nodded. His father had pressed the metal box into his hands. "This is the old paper, you hold on to it, and one day somebody's gonna come up that driveway thinkin' he's smart, and he won't be." Harold had buried his father 2 weeks later under the same oak tree where Eleanor would lie 52 years on. He had never spoken about the box to anyone, not even his wife. His father had been dead for 58 years, but he had still managed to set a trap. And Bradley Cantrell had just walked into it. Marvin Ellis Tate was 71 years old. He had practiced law in Maury County for 44 years out of a small office above the hardware store on Public Square in Mount Pleasant. He wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He carried a briefcase that had belonged to his own father, and he had known Harold Prout since the 2nd grade. He arrived at Harold's kitchen at 4:38 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. He didn't speak much. He took the coffee. He sat down, he opened the metal box, and he began to read. He read for 2 hours. Harold sat across from him the entire time, hands folded, saying nothing. The Geological Survey was first, commissioned in October of 1957 by Elias Prout, and conducted by a firm called Tennessee Subsurface Analytical out of Knoxville. The report identified a substantial natural gas formation running approximately 4,800 feet beneath the Prout property, part of what would later be called in the 1990s the Chattanooga Shale Extension. In 1957, no one had the technology to extract it. Elias Prout had simply known it was there. The mineral severance deed was second, filed June 14, 1956, properly recorded, properly notarized. It separated all subsurface rights, oil, gas, minerals, and any extractable substance from the surface estate of the 200-acre parcel, and it conveyed those rights in perpetuity to Elias Prout and his heirs and assigns. It also contained a clause Marvin Tate read 3 times before he set the page down. A clause requiring annual maintenance filing of $47 at the county records office, recorded under the original deed number, to preserve and continually reaffirm the severance. 58 years of receipts, not one missed. Then came the leather notebook. Elias Prout had kept it from 1956 until his death in 1968. He had recorded every survey crew that ever crossed the ridge, every offer the early oil companies had made him, every name and every date. And on the inside back cover in his careful pencil handwriting were the words, "They will come for it one day, they will come dressed nicely, tell them no, then send them to a judge." Marvin Tate set the notebook down. He took off his reading glasses. He looked at Harold across the kitchen table. "Harold, Cumberland Highlands been horizontal drilling out of the Briggs lease for 11 years. That well sits 490 feet from your western property line." Harold nodded slowly. "They've been pulling gas out from under your land since 2015. Harold nodded again. Marvin took a long sip of coffee. "Harold, conservative estimate, back royalties, 11 years, at standard 1/8 Tennessee mineral rate." He did the arithmetic on a napkin with a ballpoint pen. He did it twice. "Harold, you're owed somewhere north of $3.4 million, and the land is still yours, every acre of it." Harold did not react. He looked out the window at the south slope. He looked at the oak tree. Then he looked back at Marvin Tate, and he said 5 words. "How fast can we file?" The hearing was set for the 3rd Tuesday in April at 10:00 a.m. in the main chamber of the Maury County Courthouse on Public Square in Columbia, Tennessee. The Honorable Wilford Hatcher presided. He had been on the bench for 22 years. He was 68 years old. His father had been a tobacco farmer in Lawrence County, and he was known across 3 counties for 2 things: patience and an extraordinary memory for paperwork. The room was wood-paneled, with tall windows that let the morning light fall in long, pale rectangles across the floor. There were 11 people in the gallery: a reporter from the Columbia Daily Herald, 2 other Maury County lawyers who had heard rumors, and 8 neighbors of Harold Prout who had driven in that morning without being asked. Cumberland Highlands sent 4 lawyers from a Nashville firm. They wore identical dark suits. The lead counsel was a man named Trevor Ashbridge, 41 years old, partner at the firm, $900 an hour billing rate. He spoke for 18 minutes. He spoke about clerical artifacts. He spoke about presumptive surface ownership of subsurface rights in the absence of active commercial assertion. He cited 4 cases. He used the phrase good faith industry standard 11 times. He suggested that Mr. Pruitt's annual filings were a harmless eccentricity with no legal weight. Bradley Cantrell sat at the table behind him in a fresh navy suit, half smiling. When Trevor Ashbridge finished, Marvin Ellis Tate rose slowly from his chair on the other side of the room. He did not bring notes. He carried 4 items: the 1956 mineral severance deed, the 1957 geological survey, the leather notebook, and the stack of $58.47 receipts bound with a rubber band. He walked them up to the bench. He set them in front of Judge Hatcher one at a time. Then he turned to face the room, and he spoke for less than 3 minutes. Honor, in June of 1956, Elias Pruitt severed the subsurface rights of his 200-acre parcel from the surface estate. He did so in writing. He did so in this courthouse. He recorded that severance under deed number 1956-0487. He paid an annual maintenance filing every year of his life to preserve that severance, and on his death his son Harold Pruitt continued that filing every year for 58 consecutive years without interruption. The receipts are in front of you, Your Honor. Cumberland Highland Energy Partners has been extracting natural gas from beneath that parcel since November of 2015. They have not paid $1 in royalty. They have not requested one signature. They have not so much as written a letter of acknowledgement. He paused. 3 weeks ago, they offered Mr. Pruitt $8,000 for the surface they did not need, hoping to bury a mineral claim they did not believe he knew he held. He paused again. Mr. Pruitt knew, his father made sure he knew, and the state of Tennessee has the receipts. He sat down. Judge Hatcher examined the documents personally for 19 minutes. The courtroom was silent. Bradley Cantrell had stopped half smiling around minute 4. When Judge Hatcher finally looked up, he did not address Marvin Tate. He addressed Bradley Cantrell directly. Mr. Cantrell, you are the acquisitions officer of record on this transaction, are you not? Bradley stood up slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Cantrell, did your firm conduct a title search before drilling? A pause. Yes, Your Honor. Did that title search identify deed number 1956-0487? A longer pause. I would have to check, Your Honor. Mr. Cantrell, did your firm offer this man $8,000 for 200 acres of land valued at $440,000 while extracting natural gas from beneath it that you knew, or should have known, did not belong to you? Bradley Cantrell did not answer. He looked at the table. He looked at his lawyer. He looked at his hands. Judge Hatcher delivered the ruling in a voice no louder than ordinary conversation. The mineral severance was upheld in full. The surface estate remained with Mr. Harold Pruitt. Cumberland Highland Energy Partners was ordered to pay $3,418,000 in back royalties, plus interest, plus legal fees, plus a $250,000 sanction for what the judge called a willful and predatory misrepresentation of title. The gavel came down at 11:47 a.m. Bradley Cantrell did not lift his eyes from the table. Harold Pruitt nodded once at the bench, the way he nodded at the cashier in the feed store, and he walked out of the courtroom into the April sunlight. Bradley Cantrell was placed on administrative leave 11 days later. He resigned from Cumberland Highland Energy Partners on May 6, 2026, in a brief letter that cited personal reasons. His Vanderbilt MBA did not prevent him from being uninsurable in the energy acquisitions industry for the foreseeable future. The Audi Q7 was returned to the leasing company in June. He moved back to his parents' house in Brentwood that same month. Cumberland Highland stock dropped 14% in the week following the ruling. The Tennessee Attorney General opened an inquiry into the firm's title search practices across 4 counties. By August, 3 other elderly landowners in Maury County had quietly filed similar claims, each represented by Marvin Ellis Tate, each holding deeds their fathers had recorded in the 1950s. Marvin's phone, which had rung perhaps once a week for the previous decade, now rang every morning before breakfast. The settlement check was deposited into Harold Pruitt's account at the First Farmers and Merchants Bank in Mount Pleasant on the second Friday in May. Harold did not change his bank. He did not buy a new truck. He did not move out of the white clapboard house his grandfather had built with locust beams cut from the back ridge. He paid off the church roof at Mount Olive Baptist anonymously. He set up a college fund also anonymously for the daughter of the woman who ran the diner on Public Square. He paid for a new awning at the feed store, signed only, a customer. The rest he placed in trust for the preservation of family farms in Maury County, to be administered after his death by a board that included Marvin Ellis Tate and the pastor of Mount Olive Baptist. Then he drove home alone on the same gravel road he had driven home on for 58 years. He turned in at the rusted gate. He parked the 1987 Silverado in the same spot under the same hickory tree where his father had parked the 1962 Ford before him. He went inside, he made coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking out the window at the south slope where the oak tree stood. That evening, Harold Prout walked his land at sunset. He walked the western fence first, the line where the Cumberland Highland drilling had crept silently underneath for 11 years. The ground looked the same as it always had, Tennessee bluegrass, a few young cedars coming up where he hadn't bush-hogged in 3 seasons. The wind moved through the long grass the way it had moved when he was a boy. He walked north along the ridge past the old hay barn his grandfather had raised in 1911. He stopped to put his hand on one of the beams. The wood was as solid as the day it was cut. He walked east down through the swale where his father had taught him to set a trot line at the age of 7. And finally he walked south, up the slope toward the oak tree. The headstone was small, granite, Eliner's name on one side, a space beside it for his own. A few feet away under the same tree was an older marker, weathered, lichen-covered, the letters faint but still readable. Elis Pirotiti. 1909–1968. He kept his word. Harold took off his hat. He stood there for a long time as the sun went down behind the western ridge, the same ridge where 490 feet beyond his property line the silent drill had finally gone still. He spoke quietly, not loudly enough for anyone but the wind to hear. "You were right, Dad, they came in a suit, just like you said, and I sent him to a judge." He stood there a while longer. The light went gold, then rose, then gray. Then Harold Prout put his hat back on, turned, and walked slowly back down the hill toward the white clapboard house his grandfather had built. Some men never live to see what they built. They plant trees they will never sit under. They file papers no one notices for decades. They press a metal box into a 16-year-old boy's hands on a cold October morning, and they whisper a warning that has to wait 58 years to come true. Elias Prout never saw the courtroom in Columbia. He never saw the check. He never saw the 4 lawyers in dark suits stand silent while a country judge read his handwriting. But he had built the trap, and his son had been patient enough to spring it. If stories like this one still mean something to you, the quiet ones, the long ones, the ones where the old man wins because he remembered what nobody else bothered to read, then subscribe to Acre Stories and stay with us. Next time, a Kentucky widow, a 1962 grain elevator receipt, and a banker who learned the hard way that her late husband had never thrown away a single piece of paper in 41 years of marriage. We'll see you then.